Part 1. Dr. Mike Browning is a psychiatrist and researcher at the University of Oxford. His research interests include a focus on finding new treatments for people who suffer from anxiety and depression. So, Dr. Browning, can you tell us what your research is about?
So my research looks at why some people might develop illnesses such as anxiety and depression, and how those treatments for anxiety and depression might work.
And why did you become interested in this area?
So I'm a psychiatrist. I treat patients with a range of disorders, including anxiety and depression. And one of the realities of treating people with these difficulties is that the treatments that we have don't work as well as we'd like. So I do research to try and understand why people become anxious and depressed in the first place, and then I look to see whether I can use that knowledge to try and improve the treatments for these patients, so that in the future we'll have treatments that work a little bit better.
In your opinion, how much does emotion and gut reaction influence decisions in our daily lives?
Okay, so I think probably the first thing to say is that almost all of the decisions that we actually make in our daily lives we're not consciously aware of making. We make them by habit. So if you think of the example of driving to work, for example, every drive you take involves making hundreds of decisions. So how fast to go, which pedal to press, whether I turn left or right. And you're not aware of making pretty much any of those decisions. They happen by habit and automatically. And so as you can imagine, your emotions or the way you feel will influence a number of those decisions. So for example, if you're feeling really happy and buoyant, you might drive a little bit faster, and if you're sad, you might drive a little bit slower. And the other thing I think influences those decisions is what you described as gut reaction. So some of the complex decisions you make, for example, if you're thinking about driving to work, you might be at a junction and you might have to decide when it's safe to go. Now, there's a couple of ways you could make that decision. One is to calculate exactly where every other car is, what speed it's going, where it's going to be in a few seconds, and decide whether it's safe for you. Or the other is just to look and just get the feel about when it's safe. And almost everyone does the second. It's the second way of making decisions, because that's much more efficient and much quicker. So all those decisions are influenced really by your gut reaction, rather than really thinking out each decision to its logical conclusion.
Do you think that going with our gut feelings and emotions leads us to make better decisions?
Yeah, so there's clear examples when emotions will be quite useful and help you to make a decision, maybe a better decision or make the right decision more quickly. But there are other contexts where it's much better not to be driven by your emotions, and where a more considered, thought-out approach is probably the best approach. So if we take an example, if you're walking down the street and a tiger jumps out in front of you, then you're likely to feel fear. And one of the reasons that people feel fear is that it gets you ready to run away or to fight and scan your environments for threats and all the things that are a really good thing to do if a tiger jumps out. So following your emotions when a tiger jumps out is a really good idea, whereas thinking it through too much would be a really bad idea. But there are other decisions, for example, as we mentioned before, buying a car, or something that's a bit less urgent and a bit less emotionally charged, where it's often better to make a more considered decision.
Part 2. In general, are people who suffer from anxiety more likely to make decisions based on their emotions, or are they more likely to think things over more carefully?
I suppose that's quite a complex question, actually. They tend to make decisions in a different way to people who are less anxious. So whenever you make decisions, you'll often have to weigh up the pros and cons of the different options that you have available to you. And what you find with anxious people is they tend to be more averse or more worried about the bad things that might happen to them. And so that changes the decisions they make a little bit. So anxious people will tend to make decisions that they think are less likely to put them in harm's way. So that can be a good thing. But the problem is that sometimes that means that you'll miss out something really good happening because you're not willing to take the risk that maybe it won't turn out well. So to give you a sort of real-world example of this, there's a couple of studies that have suggested that if you're anxious, and particularly if you're male, if you're a man, you're less likely to be run over by a car in your 20s. And possibly because people who are anxious will look a bit more assiduously both ways to see if a car is coming. However, to balance that out, once you get up to your 30s and 40s, you're more likely to die of things like heart disease. So the worrying isn't all good. But there's obviously some benefit to being a little bit worried about the things in your environment that might harm you.